Welcome to Natural Resources University. This week's episode features Habitat University, hosted by Jared Brook and Adam Jenke.
Welcome to Habitat University. This podcast is your source for the science behind wildlife habitat management and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. We're your host, Jared Brook.
And I'm Adam Jenke, and we're both biologists and extension wildlife specialists. If you're interested in wildlife habitat management or looking for ways to improve your property for wildlife, this is the podcast for you.
So join us as we talk with researchers, managers, and landowners all about the latest research and the ins and outs of wildlife habitat management. Welcome back to Habitat University. We're continuing our journey of private lands conservation across the U.S. And this week, Adam, you went to the Show Me State, correct? And talked with folks from Missouri?
That's right. Yeah, I visited with Lisa Potter and Bill White from the Missouri Department of Conservation. They're both in the private lands team. Bill is sort of a supervisor at a higher level over private lands and community branch that we'll talk about a fair bit on the episode. And then Lisa supervises the program, the private lands program in the state.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear this episode because I think Missouri has a kind of a really cool and unique way of funding conservation through their, conservation tax. And I think that's really cool because I think it probably allows them to get a lot of boots on the ground and push a lot of resources towards private lands conservation.
Yes, and you're actually going to hear in the episode the boots on the ground answer. They have 80 people on their team working on private lands. And the impression that you'll get is that these 80 people work everywhere from with ranchers in Western Missouri on integrating native grasses into grazing systems to with people in Kansas City and St. Louis on urban pollinator conservation or urban trees and everything in between. It's so interesting to hear about sort of the breadth of work portfolio of work that they have concerning private lands in Missouri. It's interesting to hear about the history. They talk about Missouri Department of Conservation was founded with a focus on private lands, and actually Aldo Leopold played a role in that, and they talk about that. And then they also talk about how they sort of use their private lands program as a means of building enthusiasm and support for wildlife conservation within the state. So it's we're doing wildlife conservation, but at the same time, we're also building support for wildlife conservation, which is this virtuous cycle, right? Where you have support for wildlife conservation and that leads to additional funding or support for the agency. They can do more wildlife conservation and, it's a really successful and virtuous cycle. And so it was just really cool. It was just a really fun, interesting conversation, very wide ranging. And Lisa and Bill both have really neat perspectives on historical things and where they're going in the future and how they work with different types of landowners and cell conservation and everything in between. It was a lot of fun. So this was one we've been looking forward to from the beginning. I told Lisa and Bill that when we set out to do 50 solutions to the private lands challenges, we knew all along that Missouri was one of the solutions we wanted to learn about. And I don't think they disappointed in sort of sharing that example with us.
Well, that's great. So it sounds like that's a perfect stop along that journey. So we'll go ahead and get to the episode and listen to Adam's stop in Missouri about private lands conservation. And listeners, don't forget that we're always looking for your feedback. So we will have a link to an evaluation or feedback survey in the show notes. And if you enjoy the podcast, please share it with a friend. Leave us a review on however you listen to your podcasts. And of course, we're always looking for ratings as well.
Bill and Lisa, welcome to Habitat University. We are really excited to be heading to Missouri today to be learning from you. So first, I just want to sort of invite you to introduce yourselves, share with us a little bit about what your current position is, and maybe how it is that you got there in your work with the agency. So Bill, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can do that. Good morning. Thanks for having us today. So I've currently serve as our chief of our branch for community and private land conservation. I've been with the department going on 35 years. And fortunately, at least in my opinion, fortunately, it's all been engaged in the private land aspects of our work. And so I was in the field for about 16 years, serving as a biologist in Northwest Missouri, working with USDA staff and as well as department staff. And then came down here almost 20 years ago, became our Farm Bill coordinator, and then a kind of a assistant chief, and now chief.
Great, awesome. And Lisa, how about you? What's your title and how'd you get there?
Yeah, morning. So also glad to be here. Lisa Potter. And so my position with Missouri Department of Conservation is our private lands program supervisor, also within our community and private land conservation branch. And so what I do as the program supervisor, I work a lot with the Farm Bill programs and our federal partners, trying to work together to make the federal programs as well as our private land programs that we administer here at the department as friendly and user friendly as possible for landowners. So that's a big part of my role. I've been here for I think going on 15 years, and similar to Bill, I've always worked on the private land side. So I actually moved to Missouri probably about 16 years ago and started as a partnership position with Missouri Department of Conservation, and I was working directly with private landowners, so making the site visits and going out and evaluating their farms or properties and finding ways that we could work some wildlife habitat into their properties. And then after that, that's really when I started delving into the Farm Bill world, and worked as an area biologist very closely with NRCS, again with the Farm Bill programs. And then finally about 13 years ago, I entered into my current position, the private land program supervisor. So again, all private lands here with the department.
That's awesome. So in thinking about our exploration of private lands, wildlife, habitat conservation in this season of Habitat University, we knew we wanted to kind of do this approach that we've been doing, or kind of introduce a topic and then talk about federal programs and the whole alphabet soup thing. And then we wanted to do this 50 solutions to the private lands challenge. And we knew we wanted to go interview states. And one of the things that Jared and I knew right away is that we had to choose from 49 states to go do the interview, because we knew we had to get to Missouri. So when we started to think about what states are we going to go visit and learn about, Missouri was at the top of our list. And I don't know if that's just because Jared and I are both Midwestern wildlife biologists, and that's just in the Midwestern lore of like how, sort of the excellence of the Missouri Department of Conservation, or if that's even a national thing. I think it is a national thing. And that was sort of reiterated when Ray Aberle quickly told us that we needed to go meet with you two to learn about Missouri Department of Conservation's work. So I guess one, I want to sort of like just applaud your efforts. It's certainly, as you know, gains national attention. And two, I guess that's where I wanted to start the conversation is, what do you think makes Missouri Department of Conservation exceptional in this private lands thing? Like what is the history of the private lands approach and sort of the paradigm within the state towards helping wildlife on privately owned lands?
Well, Adam, our emphasis on private lands really started way back in the mid 1930s when the department was formed. We actually had Aldo Leopold help write the language that went into our Constitution. He helped with it is thought that he helped with the selection for our first director and some of our first commissioners. And so he had a major influence on how the department, when it first started, thought about private lands and the role of farmers and other private landowners, forest owners, in restoring wildlife populations. And so, way back then, things were in dire straits. The woods had been cut over, erosion was rampant. And so Aldo Leopold saw the value of private landowners and farmers in wildlife conservation. And so one of the first, I think, 5 tenets, it was maybe 6 tenets of that first commission included private lands, because 93% of Missouri is in private ownership. And so with that first commission, they hired field staff that worked with the landowners, worked with communities, and over the time, those original positions were more outreach. And so over time, then they became positions that were providing technical assistance. We had farm foresters and field service agents, and just over time, that's evolved into what we have today. And frankly, we've got the 1% state sales tax that's dedicated towards conservation, and that helps us do some of the things that we do today, which are way above and beyond what was started back in the 30s and 40s.
That's fascinating that you started with a private lands emphasis in the beginning. So you and I think that may be one way in which Missouri is unique, this focus on sort of embracing this private lands component. And you've answered one of my questions, which is what proportion of the state is in private land ownership. You said it was 93%. That's pretty impressive. That's on the high end, of course, among states. So I guess, Lisa, could you tell us then what the private lands system in Missouri looks like today, that sort of builds on that legacy that Bill introduced?
All right, absolutely. So as Bill mentioned, that conservation sales tax has really helped support obviously the entire department, but has provided Missouri the opportunity to hire full-time employees that are dedicated to private land conservation. And that is unique to many of the state fish and wildlife agencies. Slowly but surely, a lot of the other state agencies are putting more and more private land staff on. But since we had that support, one, and the funding, two, we've had dedicated private land staff since 2000 is when our branch or our division officially launched. And so that has, just having those folks that can wake up every morning and think private land conservation, that has, I think, made a huge impact on not only the acres on the ground, but just outreach, making those partnerships with our farmers, with our ag partners, because we have a private land fleet. And so right now, we've just recently gone through a reorganization. So about 2 years ago, we had around 47 private land conservationists. And now after this reorganization, we're, I think, around 80 or so staff that are either directly only working private land conservation or have private land conservation roles or parts of their position. So we have increased the number of folks that are able to get out there and do good things on that 93% of our state that is private.
Wow, 80 staff working on private lands. That is really remarkable. So I would like to understand more about like what the day-to-day for those 80 people is. I'm curious, like, what sort of geography do they cover, and what sort of things do they work with landowners and farmers and community leaders with in their day-to-day jobs? Like what's one of those interactions look like, or what's a day in the life of one of those 80 people look like?
So most of these field staff have 2 to 3 counties, and there's exceptions to that. We might have a fisheries biologist that has 5 to 10 counties, or a forester that has more than 2 to 3 counties. But so they're working with private landowners, with our partners. It might be Ducks Unlimited or USDA. They're working with communities and partners within those communities, trying to make a difference for people both in rural landscapes as well as in our more urbanized landscapes. And probably a typical day, they spend a lot of their time in the field visiting with landowners and then writing follow-up plans and recommendations. They take advantage of cost share programs for those landowners who are interested in receiving cost share from either our own internal programs or from USDA Farm Bill programs. We help landowners find the specialized equipment they may need to install those practices, be it burn equipment or a native warm season grass drill or a tree planter and so on. And so, like I said, most of their day is going to be visiting with landowners and then writing those follow-up plans, coordinating with partners. A lot of times we've got some partner positions out there that also work with landowners, so they might coordinate on a project together. It might be a field day or a landowner workshop, something along those lines. We do webinars for landowners, you name it. But again, most of that day is writing plans and or doing site visits, follow-up visits with landowners.
So Bill, one question I have sort of backing up is you mentioned that the branch I think that you lead is called Community and Private Lands Conservation. Did I get that right?
Correct.
I'm curious about the community part of that. Like, how does that integrate into private lands conservation, and what's the sort of genesis of that label in the branch?
Well, one of the things we realize in this modern world is, more and more people are moving to towns or cities, and so we need to keep a connection with nature with those citizens as well, to maintain that, that interest in conservation, the desire to see things done on the landscape in the name of conservation, and so on. So we have a pretty robust, I'm not sure that any other state Fish and Wildlife agency in the nation has this robust of a program, but we try to work with cities and towns, the partners within those landscapes, and try and get a lot of interest in pollinator plots and tree plantings and the like, just as a means to get more people connected to nature. And we know that even in a city where we're doing like a pollinator plot, we are benefiting some of the native pollinators that are in decline, even in those landscapes. And so we've focused quite a bit of work here lately, especially trying to reach partners and reach those cities and towns, no matter if it's a little rural town out in northern Missouri or it's St. Louis or Kansas City. And we're working with audiences we've never worked with before, and again, connecting more people to nature than ever before in my eyes. So it's been a pretty good focus here the last couple of years, and we've been working on it, trying to figure out a way to reach those communities over the last 20 years. And the last 2 to probably 5 years, we've really broadened that scope of work. And so we've got a lot of partnerships that we've developed, cooperative positions with communities in order to make those inroads, because we just don't have enough staff to work with the millions of people in Missouri that live in our cities and towns.
I think that is a really cool, admirable, and progressive angle to take on the private lands challenge. We tend to think about like big landowners and sort of decisions that people make, particularly in rural landscapes, but the relatively small decisions, as you mentioned, millions of people are making in cities and towns, do have a cumulative impact in a couple of ways, both ecologically, like urban conservation priorities, which is certainly a challenge and an opportunity area, but then also, as you mentioned, building interest and enthusiasm for wildlife conservation into the hearts and minds of more people. So that is a really interesting angle that you all take, and it's pretty cool that that's included in the umbrella of private lands conservation.
Yeah, some of our surveys that we've been involved in, like 50% of urban residents connect to nature in their backyard. So we need to look for ways to get native plants and those kind of things into backyards. So it's tough having limited staffing to be able to do that. So we rely on partners an awful lot to help break those barriers and get more native plants out there.
I'm really interested in this community conservation component of the work that you all do. And then of course, I'm really interested in the sort of agricultural and I assume also forestry work that you do on private land. So Lisa, I guess a question I have for you is, put me in the shoes of these 80 wildlife biologists on the farm. You mentioned that, or farm or in the city, you mentioned that these folks are often meeting with landowners and community members and decision makers. I'm curious, what sort of questions are they answering? Like, what are the questions that private landowners or community members most often have about wildlife habitat on their properties?
That's a good question, because it really runs the gamut. And that's probably something that keeps the job so interesting and fun, is because each farm is a little bit different. But one of the common, I guess I'll talk about two scenarios. So one scenario might be, they're working with a family that has been on that piece of property, farm, hobby farm, what have you, for generations. And they'll ask, when I was a kid, I saw quail all over the place. We had pheasants, we had rabbits. I mean, it was a wildlife mecca when I was a kid. And then they ask, well, I don't see that anymore. Where did all the quail go? And so that's a common question that kind of starts just the discussion, the education of how, wildlife management is a continual process. Succession is always happening. So you can't just, do a shrub planting or a native forward planting once and leave it and never come back. So it's about going back and making sure that we're adding disturbance to that system. So a lot of the questions, stemming from, how do I get my quail back, is okay, well, how do I plant a native forward planting? What species do I need? How can I manage my timber stand where, hey, I could actually maybe, sell some timber, but also create a wonderful stand for deer and turkey. And so those are some of the common questions. And then probably the second scenario is the new landowner, that they have purchased their piece of property and they bought it for entertainment, and they want to figure out ways on how to maximize their wildlife experience. And then those questions are typically, what do I need to do to my property to get more deer or invite more turkey? And so then it gets into how heavily do I thin my timber stand? And then of course there's always the food plots. Do I need a food plot? Do I plant a green browse food plot or a grain food plot? And so it just gets into it is determined by what those landowners' objectives are, and where that conversation is going to go with that private land conservationist.
So then you mentioned deer, turkeys, quail. Is that what's bringing people in the door primarily, or are there portions of the state where people have questions about other types of wildlife, or maybe back to the communities thing that Bill shared, maybe there's different species of wildlife there. I'm just curious, like, what other sorts of things are people thinking about or actively managing on private lands in Missouri?
Well, just, probably the last 10 years, the interest in doing something for monarch butterflies or other native pollinators has been rapidly increasing. And I don't know what it would be like today, but up to a couple of years ago, it was probably at least 10% of our contacts were people who were initially interested in pollinators. We do have some wetland biologists that work primarily with USDA on wetland reserve easements. And so there's a lot of duck hunters they work with, and just wetland enthusiasts in general. But most of it has to do with, a wildlife species, but in the process, we can restore habitat, whether it's a glade or a woodland community that's taken over in the Ozarks by red cedar, or, in some cases, honeysuckle if you're closer to a big city. It could be prairie restoration. We've got some areas of the state where we have private land conservationists working with cattle producers. And the main gist there is they're trying to get native grasses incorporated in grazing systems. We've got ag producers in North Missouri that recognize that along a hedgerow, they're not getting any profit off of that ground because the hedgerow is sapping cropland. So we work with them on buffers. I mean, just about anything you can think of scenario wise, we're able to help landowners with. We got pond management specialists, foresters and the like. So a lot going on out there, and it could be all those variations in one particular private land conservationist district.
And I might add a little something to that, and just kind of a cool offshoot to maybe someone who is interested in, just more turkey or more quail. So, one of the recommendations we're likely to provide is that you need some breeding habitat, some early successional. You need a lot of forbs out there, diversity out there. And once you put that in, well, that's going to attract the pollinators. That's going to attract the grassland birds. And then all of a sudden, this person that was really only interested in one thing, all of a sudden is calling you up and saying, "Oh my gosh, I saw 20 monarch butterflies in my pollinator plot." And so then they start getting excited, and it just expands their view in terms of what they're surrounded with on their farm in terms of wildlife diversity. So that's a really cool part of that one-on-one relationship that we can develop with landowners.
That is a really cool opportunity that you have with having so many staff that cover so much different area and have an opportunity to build those relationships. And yeah, maybe long beards and big antlers gets them in the door, but then, as you mentioned, they kind of grow in their relationships to land and are eventually managing ecosystems or managing invertebrates or something really different. So that's really exciting and admirable. I'm curious, Lisa, back to this question about like, what questions do people have? So you shared a couple of the questions, and then you also, you sort of started to share the answers and how the answers lead to more questions and so on and so forth. And so I'm curious, once you start these conversations, where does it end in terms of like programs that you're trying to work with people on? You've mentioned already a bunch of FSA and NRCS programs. And so I'm just curious, like, what sort of focus you have on federal programs, or also what sort of unique state programs you offer to landowners after you've sort of started this conversation and they want to do something. How do you help them do something on their land?
So financial assistance programs are very important to conservation in general and private land conservation, maybe especially because wildlife management is expensive. There's a lot of people and they want to do great things, but we all have to pay the bills, and maybe you don't have an extra huge discretionary income where you can do all the management that you'd like to on your property. So being able to offer a variety of programs where we're providing 50 to 90% cost share depending on program, to help them financially pay for their management. And so we have a lot of different programs, whether that's a state-run program or a federal-run program. And one of the reasons why there's so many programs is so it can be tailored to the different needs out there. So for instance, here at MDC, we have a state cost share program, landowner assistance cost share program. And so that program is available to private landowners, and how landowners sign up, they work with the private land conservationist. But like I mentioned before, we can provide 50 to 90% cost share depending on the practice. And so our state cost share program, that might be the best for a landowner that's just wanting to do a smaller project. They want to put in a 10-acre pollinator plot, or they want to manage 20 acres of timber. So the smaller quote unquote projects. And then you have your federal programs that obviously have much more federal funding supporting those. So a lot bigger pots of money. So for landowners that might have bigger projects, those programs like the EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, or CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. So those programs might be best for a landowner that has a larger project in mind. And so we talked about, kind of the average day of a private lands biologist. Well, the fun part, is going out and working with the landowner, doing the site visit, making up the plans. Probably the not so fun part is learning all the programs. But that's really important, because as long as they know the programs that are out there, and there are a lot of programs, then when they're working on different farms, they're going to say, oh, well, this would be perfect for CRP, or this would be perfect for LCAP, or our state cost share program. And so that's a huge part in being able to make an impact on private land, to be able to provide that financial assistance to landowners.
LCAP was an acronym you just said. Is that landowner cost assistance program?
Landowner and community assistance program.
Oh, and community assistance program. Okay, great. So what's the history of that program? And you mentioned it's relatively, it kind of targets smaller parcels. How do people use that across the state?
So that program really got its start back in 1999 when we dedicated an entire division to private land and community work. And it's been evolving over those last 20 years. Here in the last couple of years, we've added some of our community assistance funding to that program. And so I don't know, we're probably somewhere around $3 million for private land and community assistance through that program. And it's a tool for our staff to use. And then we've also got some partner staff like Quill Forever who also utilize it to some degree. But as Lisa said, it's to help starting work, especially with a new cooperator, getting their feet on the ground, trying not to overwhelm them with lots of large projects. And then once they get their feet on the ground, it looks like they're interested in pursuing bigger projects, we look at something like the Farm Bill that has a lot more money available.
So have you seen that in practice work? Like it's like basically a gateway drug to wildlife habitat conservation. Could you share an example of how it is that you've got people in the door with your LCAP program that's ultimately resulted in maybe some big changes?
So, again, give lots of examples. One that comes to mind is, we'll get a landowner, then invite us out to the property. They're interested in doing something for deer and or turkey. They've got a forested property for the most part, and their idea when they had and are inviting you out there is they're going to put in a food plot. And so that starts a conversation about you really need to do some forest stand improvement, or thin the cedars out of your woodland, and all conversations along those lines. So the landowner's not real sure, so we offer them cost share. Let's start on 10 acres. And we offer them the cost share to do forest stand improvement on there, with the idea that we're going to benefit the property for deer and or turkey. And then once they complete that and like what they see and they want to do more, we may continue to use our cost share program, but a lot of times we will then evolve over to a farm bill program where we can do bigger contracts, longer contracts, and get a lot more work done. So that's a pretty common scenario, especially across our forested landscape, where we're getting them to put their foot in the door and having a small success and then wanting to do more. And a lot of times, man, as Lisa said, there'll be a pollinator plot associated with that, because it's good for turkey brood rearing. It's good for those does after they drop fawns for high protein diet. I mean, just pollinator plots do a lot of things for a lot of different species other than just pollinators. So it just goes on from there. There might be some fescue conversion to native grasses for turkey nesting. You never know where that's going to go. It just depends on the landowner and how interested they are in pursuing. But again, a lot of times it's the landowners inviting you out thinking they want a food plot, or not really sure what they want. So you got to start small.
To what extent in your programs are you sort of proactively approaching landowners versus sort of waiting for them to come to you? I sort of hear in the way you're talking about what you do, I sort of hear a mix of both. And I'm just curious to get a better grasp of, like, are there scenarios in which you proactively approach landowners? And if so, what do those look like? And what's that proposition like?
So we do try to focus our work because it seems we have more success with wildlife populations, natural community management. So just an example is we've got a number of quail focal landscapes that are, primarily private land. There might be some public land mixed into there, but that's how we found is our best chance of success in restoring quail. And so you have to take a proactive approach and knock on doors or mailings, or invite people to a field tour, neighbors to a field tour, knock on doors, phone calls, and the like, to get those people, I guess, engaged that wouldn't otherwise darken our doorstep, wouldn't voluntarily come to us. And so that's fairly common. And we've got grassland focal areas where we have some prairie remnants, and staff are trying to help restore that more prairie landscape for grassland birds, and the native plants and critters that come with all of that. We've got some forest landscapes that are priority, some wetland landscapes that are priority, mainly along the major rivers. And so there's a lot of proactive work that has to take effect to get that concentrated effort and more habitat on the landscape to make a difference.
So what's different about those landowner interactions versus one where you get the phone call to come talk about a food plot?
So the one that's inviting us, they've got more or less an open mind to, wanting to do some habitat work. And the other situation where we have to be more proactive, we actually have to sell, whether it's habitat restoration or prairie restoration or whatever it is. And so economics, a lot of times, are going to figure into that, because a lot of these landowners are going to be cattle producers, row crop producers. So economics are going to fit in there. Having the equipment available is going to have to fit in there. Having enough boots on the ground in an area to make sure we can help those landowners with what they decide they want to go. So it's a different conversation, and got to be more of a salesman in those situations.
So it sounds like you also have to know a fair bit about the primary production practices on the land
Oh,
too.
yeah.
I think you just
Yeah.
mentioned like planter, like how big the planter is or something.
Yeah, so, just an example of that, our staff that are working in with cattle producers, I mean, they have to know something about livestock and pastures and the like, and understand the economics behind some of that. So to be able to have that conversation, to gain that trust relationship, and to move forward with getting that landowner to say yes to a practice.
So Lisa, you mentioned you did this work for a number of years before going to your leadership role within the agency. And then of course you supervise people making these sales pitches day to day. So give me the pitch. What's the sales pitch for wildlife conservation? You could pick a landscape, because I know Missouri's remarkably diverse. I mean, you're talking about Western rangeland, and then you're talking about Ozark forests. You're talking about like Northern Missouri, row crops and floodplain wetlands. And I mean, it's in cities. Like, wow, it is a really diverse state. So I know the sales pitch is going to be different in those different landscapes, but what are the elements of your sales pitch for in those conversations that Bill's talking about?
Well, it's been a few years since I've had to personally give this, but I will do my best. I guess I'll choose the easy one. You're working with an ag producer, and for whatever reason, he invited you out there. You're walking the farm together, and so you're walking by his bean field or cornfield, and you notice that the first 15, 20 feet of corn are, not producing well. So then you start the conversation of, hey, we could probably, save you X amount of dollar in input costs if we put in a buffer right here along your field. So that would be one way to start the conversation. So again, you'd start with the economics of, how can this be beneficial to your bottom line, to your farm? You can also say, not only are you reducing your input costs and potential financial loss in those acres, but you're also, providing water quality aspects and soil quality for anything that's, potentially running off the field. Not to mention all the wildlife that will benefit from that buffer. If you're working with a livestock producer, and you're walking around the farm and you notice, it's currently all in fescue and it's the middle of summer, and it's all burnt up. And so that would be an easy way to start. What do you think about trying, in this the back 10 acres of trying a warm season grass for forage? Nothing big, nothing that's gonna to negatively impact their bottom line, I guess, or their herd for a year or two. But just try it and explain, well, this is going to be, the cattle, actually gain more when they're foraging on warm season. Not to mention you don't have the issues, with fescue toxicity and things like that. And by the way, it's drought tolerant. And so, this time in July next year, this is going to be your wonderfully green field while you're having issues with fescue being too dry and lower quality. So again, it's working that economics. It's having the conversation of how can we do good things on your farm for not only wildlife, but soil and water that is actually at the end of the day going to benefit your operation. Farming is very expensive. I like to eat. We need farms out there. And so finding a way that where conservation and farming is compatible, and I believe 100% it is, that's where we are going, where we're trying to go, where we continue to need to go with private land conservation, at least on the working landscape, if you will.
Fascinating response to the question, and I totally agree, and I love your thinking on it, and I think those are very compelling sales pitches. So now I'm wondering, like, if we step back up to like this sort of organization, you mentioned this working land strategy, and I think of that as like, what's a little bit that everybody could do on private lands? Like everybody can have a warm season pasture. Everybody can find profit loss areas on the farm and convert them to perennial vegetation, versus a lot of things that one person could do on one property. And I think of that as like the private lands conservation paradigm of like recreating wildlife refuges or recreating wildlife areas on private lands. And so I hear very clearly in our conversation that your strategy is a mix of both of those. It sounds like the same people are working on working farms, trying to get a little bit on a lot of acres, as working on a recreational property, as you had mentioned earlier in the conversation. So I'm wondering, is there an explicit strategy within the agency of favoring one of those over another? Or is there, does it just kind of depend on who comes, I don't know, a species priority? So I guess, how do you think about that? Like, I'm thinking out loud here, but like, just share with me your thinking about these two extreme paradigms of private lands conservation, a little bit on a lot of acres or a lot on a few acres. And which do you think is best? And you can't say everything because it's my game and I'm making the rules.
Yeah, and it, it's going to depend, but our primary focus is, we don't have, even though we've got 80 staff dedicated to private lands and communities, it's still not enough. Because as word of mouth spreads, we get people coming to us that, like I say, have never darkened our doorstep before, and so we try to focus on those areas of the state where we have the biggest bang for the buck as far as natural community restoration, species of conservation concern, but we're not refusing to work with any landowner that comes to us that is wanting assistance. So we've got, as I mentioned earlier, we've got some quail focus areas, we've got wetland focus areas, we've got grassland focus areas, we've got glade and woodland community focus areas. So we try and concentrate our time and our dollars there. But again, we do service all the landowners that are coming to us. We've got partnerships with other organizations like Quail Forever, Ducks Unlimited and the like, where they've also got staff assisting private landowners so they can help with the demand out there and help implement some of these programs. So, but there's also this thought out there that especially these migrating species, and I'm going to say monarchs and maybe grassland birds, all in steep decline. There's no way that we're going to restore those by populations by working on a little pocket of the state. We do have to have along those migration paths, spring and fall migration, the habitat they need to keep them fueled on that migration. So, we're looking at, I don't know how many counties in Northwest Missouri along the I-35 corridor for monarchs. And it's more of a broad-based focus. And, we're working with crop producers to put in buffers that would impact monarchs. Coincidentally, will also have a favorable impact on things like quail or some of the migrating grassland songbirds, and not trying to focus, the prairies in Southwest Missouri are where we need to do for monarchs. It's not going to work. We need those migration stops all along that migration pathway.
And I'll add to that. So I guess my initial answer to your question is bigger is better. I mean, if we can get a whole field enrolled, I mean, it to prairie conservation or, restore prairie, that obviously is going to be the best case. But that's obviously not a reality everywhere on the landscape. I mean, I think somewhere around 30 million acres are in ag production in Missouri. So a lot of those farms, they don't have just an extra field that they can return to a prairie. So buffers are going to be maybe the best that we can do on that farm. And so maybe if that buffer is just going to be an island out there and none of his neighbors are out doing buffers, that's probably not going to do much. But if those neighbors start talking, or if we focus that into a focal area that Bill has been mentioning, you get a bunch of farmers doing field borders or in their pivot corners or what have you. That acreage starts to add up. And so even though each individual parcel that you're helping to restore is small, if you get enough landowners in that same area, you start growing that acreage. So it's I guess it's based on where you are in the state and what kind of landscape you're working with. But the easy button is bigger is always better, but that's not always available.
Fascinating answers to that question, and fun to hear how you two that have been thinking about this for a career think about these private lands challenges. And I think the answer was yes, like anything to get more habitat on the ground works. So I'll take it. I really appreciate that. I just have one last question, and it's a big one, but I just kind of want to invite you to reflect on your careers and the successes that MDC has in private lands conservation, sort of creative programs you've come up with or tried over the years, and share with me, what are you most proud of that Missouri does for private lands wildlife habitat?
I guess I'll take a first swing, and I still have several years to go in my career. So I hope to continue accomplishing the good things for conservation. But I think one of the most things or what I'm most proud of maybe right now is just the fact of how much Missouri Department of Conservation focuses on private land, because a lot of state agencies can't say that or aren't there yet. They might be working towards it, but we have a long history of acknowledging the importance of private land conservation, and the staff that work private lands are some of the most dedicated people I think you'll ever meet. But I'm proud that I work for a state that recognizes that importance. With a state with 93% private land ownership, there is no way that we will be able to maintain our wildlife populations diversity without private landowners. And so in my mind, it is critically important that we continue to grow our private land conservation program, and then other state agencies are able to grow theirs, because so Missouri's 93%. Well, I think the entire country is like 70% privately owned. And we have our public lands, and they are essential. We have to have those. Those are our strongholds. But obviously the populations continue to decline. Threatened endangered species continue to increase. So we can't only do public land conservation. We're not going to be able to win this, to protect our diversity and our wildlife species out there if we do not include private land. So I'm very, very proud to work for a state that recognizes that, and will hopefully continue to grow that effort the rest of my career and onward.
And I think for me, it's I'm most proud of the relationships that we've built, whether it's with the private landowners we're working with, or our partners, no matter whether they're rural partners or city partners, and the land ethic that many develop. And this goes back to Leopold again, but that land ethic that a lot of people adopt after having worked with our staff, built that relationship, understand the possibilities out there. And I'll give you I'll give you a couple examples. So a group we're working with in St. Louis called Beyond Housing, we helped them hire a community forester. And I don't know how long ago that was, but we've just found out this year that now they've seen the success of that community forester, and now they've started their own forestry department within their organization, and hired an additional forester and I think some interns and the like, just expanding what they've been able to do before, doing it all on their own. And then a landowner comes to mind that we started working with probably 13, 14 years ago. And man, he's become an apostle for conservation. And it's because we build a relationship and help them see the possibilities, and then they see the benefits of the habitat restoration, the wildlife response, and all that. But they're big promoters of the conservation ethic, and have had, I don't know, 10,000 people or more out at their farm for tours, and they have fun runs and just all sorts of events out there. And he is actually now a state legislator in Missouri, and is spreading the conservation message at the Capitol. So I think it's the relationships that we help build, and that ethic that we help instill in a lot of the people we work with.
Thank you both for sharing your thinking on that. I think both of those are just fascinating answers. And we think about private lands conservation as a means to help wildlife species, but while we're doing it, we're building passion and compassion for wildlife and natural places into the hearts and minds of citizens everywhere from St. Louis to pastures in Southwest Missouri and everywhere in between. I think that's a really cool takeaway from this conversation today. So Bill and Lisa, thank you very much for your time and perspectives and your work for private lands conservation. And thank you for coming on to Habitat University to share with us what you know.
Thanks for having
Yeah,
us.
thank you. Appreciate it.
Habitat University is hosted by Purdue Extension and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Habitat University, subscribe and listen to the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
Iowa State University and Purdue University are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.